June 24, 2024. Hampton, Virginia, 11:36 in the morning. Julia Tomlin calls police to report her young son Noah missing. She tells officers she last saw him at 1 o'clock that morning when she put him to bed in their mobile home. When she checked on him hours later, he was gone. The story seems straightforward. A toddler wandering away from home, a mother's worst nightmare. But investigators quickly noticed something that didn't add up. If Noah disappeared at 1 o'clock in the morning and Julia discovered he was missing when she woke up, why did she wait until almost noon to call police? 10 hours. 10 hours of silence. 10 hours that, according to FBI investigators, would tell a very different story than the one Julia was sharing, because Noah wasn't missing. According to the evidence that would emerge, Noah was already deceased. And those 10 hours weren't about a frantic search. They were about covering tracks, cleaning evidence, and constructing a lie. This is the Noah Tomlin case, and this is how a 10-hour delay exposed the truth that changed everything. To understand why this delay matters, we need to look at what Julia Tomlin told police versus what investigators would eventually discover. According to Julia's initial report to Hampton Police, the timeline was simple. She put Noah to bed around 1 in the morning. This wasn't unusual, she claimed. When she woke up later that morning and went to check on him, he was gone. She searched the house. She looked outside. Panic set in. And at 11:36 a.m. she finally called authorities. On the surface, this could explain the delay. A mother waking up, discovering her child missing, searching frantically before calling for help. But investigators had immediate questions. Why 1 in the morning? Why was a toddler being put to bed at that hour? Why did it take over 10 hours to report? And most critically, if you discovered your child was missing, wouldn't you call police immediately? Every parent knows that when a child disappears, every minute counts. Every second could mean the difference between finding them safe or facing an unthinkable tragedy. So why the delay? Hampton Police Division investigators made note of this discrepancy from the very beginning. It was the first red flag in what would become a case full of them. The Hampton Police Division responded in force. This was a missing child, a toddler who, according to his mother, couldn't walk well and might have developmental delays. If he had wandered away, time was critical. Chief Terry Salt mobilized every available resource. Search teams deployed throughout the neighborhood around Atlantic Avenue, where Julia's mobile home was located. This normally quiet Hampton neighborhood was suddenly overtaken by crime scene tape, search parties, and forensic units. Volunteers combed through yards, checked under porches, looked in sheds and abandoned buildings. They searched storm drains. They knocked on doors. The police brought in K-9 units trained specifically for search and rescue operations. They brought in aerial drones to scan areas from above. They searched waterways with side-scan sonar technology. The Coast Guard was called to assist with maritime areas. Virginia Department of Emergency Management sent their search teams. State police provided mobile command posts. The FBI was called in to assist with the investigative side. According to Hampton Police Chief Terry Salt, they would eventually dedicate over 10,000 man-hours to searching for Noah. They would look through 1,000 tons of garbage by hand. That's 2 million pounds of trash searched piece by piece, looking for any sign of the missing child. Officers volunteered to work extra shifts. Some worked around the clock, refusing to go home until Noah was found. But while search teams scoured Hampton, while volunteers walked shorelines and searched wooded areas, while divers went into the water and drone operators scanned from above, investigators were examining something else, the timeline. And the more they looked, the less Julia's story made sense. The investigative team, working alongside FBI agents, began interviewing everyone who had recent contact with Julia and Noah. And that's when 2 critical witnesses came forward. 2 men whose testimony would completely dismantle Julia's narrative about when Noah disappeared. The first was a man named Brad Bailey. According to his court testimony, he knew Julia Tomlin and claimed to be the father of one of her children. On June 22nd, 2 days before Julia reported Noah missing, Bailey testified that Julia called him repeatedly. She needed help, she said. She needed cleaning supplies. Child Protective Services might be coming, and her home wasn't suitable. She was panicked, according to Bailey. She needed to get the house cleaned up, and she needed supplies to do it. Bailey agreed to help. He went to her mobile home that afternoon, arriving between 1 and 1:30 p.m., and according to his testimony under oath in court, Noah was there, alive, playing in the living room. Bailey testified that his focus wasn't primarily on Noah during this visit. He was there to drop off supplies, but he saw the child. Noah was present in the home, moving around, alive and visible. Bailey's testimony was clear and unequivocal. On June 22nd, in the early afternoon, Noah Tomlin was alive. This established a critical timestamp for investigators. Whatever happened to Noah, it happened after this visit. After 1:30 in the afternoon on June 22nd, the second witness was Brian Null. According to his court testimony, he also went to Julia's home on June 22nd, but later that same day, several hours after Bailey's visit. Null testified that there was some question about whether he might be Noah's biological father. He wanted his daughter to meet Noah. He wanted to see if there was a family connection there. When he arrived at Julia's mobile home that evening, he asked to see the child. He brought his daughter with him specifically for this purpose, but Julia refused. She told him Noah was sleeping. She wouldn't let Null into the room. She wouldn't let him peek in. She wouldn't let his daughter meet Noah. Noah was asleep, she insisted, and couldn't be disturbed. Null testified that he tried to negotiate. He asked if they could just quietly look in on Noah without waking him, just to see the child. But Julia was firm. No, Noah was sleeping and could not be seen. According to investigators, this testimony was critical. Think about the timeline. 2 men visited Julia's home on the same day, June 22nd. The first man, Bailey, arrived in the early afternoon and saw Noah alive and playing. The second man, Null, arrived later that evening and was told Noah was sleeping, but was denied any access to the child. What happened between those 2 visits? What changed in those few hours that caused Julia to refuse to let anyone see Noah? An FBI agent from the Behavioral Science Unit at Quantico interviewed Julia extensively over multiple sessions. The Behavioral Science Unit is the FBI's elite team of criminal profilers and interrogation specialists, the same unit that has worked on some of the most complex and high-profile cases in American criminal history. These agents are trained to detect deception, to understand criminal behavior, and to build rapport with subjects to elicit truthful information. According to the agent's testimony in court, Julia eventually confessed to what happened on June 22nd. She told the agent that Noah died in the bathtub. She said she had left him unattended during a bath. He hit his head. He drowned. It was an accident, she claimed. A tragic accident. According to Julia's version of events, she stepped away briefly, and when she returned, Noah was deceased in the bathtub. But instead of calling 911, instead of seeking help, instead of reporting this tragic accident to authorities who could have documented it and investigated it properly, Julia told the FBI agent she did something else. She took Noah's body. She removed him from the bathtub. She dried him off. She put him in his bed. She made it look like he was sleeping peacefully. She positioned him as though he were taking a nap. This, according to her confession, is why when Brian Null came to the house later that evening, she wouldn't let him see Noah. The child he thought was sleeping was already deceased. Julia was maintaining an elaborate deception, keeping up appearances, pretending her son was alive when she knew he wasn't. But Julia's confession to the FBI didn't end there. According to the agent's testimony, Julia admitted she kept Noah's body in the mobile home for some period of time. She didn't specify exactly how long. And then, at some point over the next 2 days, she placed his remains in a diaper box. She sealed it, and she had a friend dispose of the box with the household trash, not telling this friend what was actually inside. The friend, unknowingly, threw away the box as Julia requested. All of this happened on June 22nd and in the days immediately following. Yet Julia didn't report Noah missing until June 24th at 11:36 in the morning. And when she did report him missing, she didn't tell police about a bathtub accident. She didn't mention that Noah had been deceased for 2 days. She didn't explain that she had disposed of his body. Instead, she constructed an entirely different narrative. A story about a child who disappeared from his bed sometime after 1 in the morning on June 24th. A story about a mother who woke up to find her son gone. A mystery that would require massive search efforts. Resources that would be deployed across Hampton, searching land, air, and water for a child Julia knew wasn't missing because she knew exactly where he was. When Hampton Police detectives and FBI agents began processing Julia's mobile home as a potential crime scene, they found evidence that contradicted her story. According to testimony presented in court, investigators discovered bloodstains that had been cleaned. The blood evidence was still detectable through forensic analysis, but someone had attempted to remove it. Walls had been wiped down. Cleaning solutions had been used. A shirt with blood evidence was found during the search. The physical evidence suggested something violent had occurred in that home. Something that required cleanup. Something that didn't match the story of a simple bathtub accident Julia was now claiming. Forensic analysts processed the scene using luminol and other chemical agents that revealed blood, even after cleaning attempts. They documented the patterns. They took samples. They photographed everything. And the evidence told a story. This wasn't consistent with a child accidentally drowning and being quietly moved. This was consistent with violence, with trauma, with someone trying to cover up what had really happened. And then came the most damning evidence of all, the medical examiner's findings. When search crews eventually located Noah's remains at the Hampton NASA steam plant in July, where city trash is converted to energy, the medical examiner conducted a thorough autopsy and forensic analysis. What they found, according to court testimony, was horrifying. The medical examiner testified that Noah had suffered blunt force trauma, but these weren't recent injuries from a fall in a bathtub on June 22nd. According to the autopsy report presented in court, Noah had multiple fractures. Fractures to his skull, fractures to his ribs, fractures to his jaw. And according to the medical examiner's expert opinion, these injuries weren't from one incident. They weren't from one accident. They represented a pattern of abuse that had been ongoing for some period of time. The fractures were at different stages of healing, which medical examiners can determine by examining bone tissue and the body's healing response. Some were older, some were more recent. This indicated repeated trauma over weeks or possibly months. The injuries were so severe, the medical examiner testified, that Noah's bones had stopped growing properly. His body was shutting down from repeated trauma. This was a child who had been suffering for a long time. Commonwealth's attorney Anton Bell, who prosecuted the case, described Noah's injuries in court. He said the damage was consistent with a child falling several stories from a building. These were not minor injuries. These were not the result of normal childhood accidents. These were catastrophic injuries that would have caused immense pain. The medical examiner made it abundantly clear in testimony. This child had been subjected to severe and ongoing physical trauma. This was not an accident. This was abuse, systematic, repeated, brutal abuse. And then came another disturbing detail from the investigation. According to the medical examiner, when Noah's remains were found, his body was in an advanced state of decomposition. The level of decomposition was consistent with investigators' belief that Noah had been deceased for several days before being reported missing. This physical evidence supported the timeline established through witness testimony and contradicted Julia's claim that Noah had only recently disappeared. The forensic evidence, the witness testimony, and Julia's own conflicting statements were all pointing to the same conclusion. Noah died on or around June 22nd, and Julia spent the next 2 days covering it up. So what really happened during those 10 hours between 1 a.m. and 11:36 a.m. on June 24th? According to the evidence presented by investigators, the timeline Julia gave police was completely false from the beginning. Noah didn't disappear from his bed at 1 o'clock in the morning on June 24th. According to the evidence, Noah was already deceased days before that. The 10-hour delay wasn't Julia waking up and discovering her son missing and then spending time searching before calling police. The delay was Julia deciding when to report a death she already knew about. It was time spent constructing a story that might be believable. Time spent making sure all the evidence was cleaned properly. Time spent rehearsing her narrative. Time spent preparing for the questions she knew investigators would ask when they arrived. Investigators believe Julia used those hours, and indeed the entire 2 days before making the report, to finalize her narrative, to make sure details were consistent with her story, to create the appearance of a missing child case rather than what it actually was. She needed time to get her story straight, to think through what questions police might ask, to prepare answers, to make sure nothing in her home would contradict the narrative she was about to present. And she needed to wait long enough that the evidence she had disposed of would be well hidden in the city's waste management system, buried under tons of other garbage, hopefully never to be found. And there's something else that makes this 10-hour delay, and indeed the entire cover-up, even more significant. Julia Tomlin wasn't new to the child welfare system. She wasn't someone who had no prior interaction with authorities regarding child safety. According to court records in 2010, 14 years before Noah's death, Julia was convicted of child neglect involving one of her daughters. The criminal complaint detailed serious injuries sustained by the child that required medical attention. According to the detective's report from that case, neither Julia nor the child's father sought hospital treatment for their daughter, despite the severity of her injuries. Julia was convicted. She went through the court system. She had a criminal record for harming a child in her care. This was documented. This was known. Yet somehow, 14 years later, in 2024, she had custody of 10 children. 10 children, all living in her mobile home, all under her supervision, all dependent on her for their safety and well-being. How does this happen? How does someone with a conviction for child neglect maintain custody of, or gain custody of, 10 children over the following years? This is the question Noah's family members are asking. This is the question child welfare advocates are asking. This is the systemic failure that allowed this tragedy to occur. When investigators arrested Julia on June 29th, 5 days after she reported Noah missing, they also discovered something else that deepened the investigation. According to the arrest warrants, Julia was charged with felony child neglect not just in connection with Noah's death, but for 3 other children who were in her care at the time. The warrants alleged she had neglected a toddler, a preschool-aged child, and an infant. All 3 were living in the mobile home with her. And critically, these charges were dated June 22nd, the same day Brad Bailey saw Noah alive. The same day Brian Null was told Noah was sleeping. The same day Julia now claims Noah died in a bathtub accident. Investigators have not publicly explained the full significance of this date discrepancy, saying only that it speaks to deeper elements of the investigation that were ongoing. But it raises serious questions. Were the other children also being harmed? Did investigators find evidence of neglect or abuse toward Noah's siblings on that same day? What exactly was happening in that mobile home that would result in multiple felony child neglect charges, all dated to the same day? The investigation suggested this wasn't just about Noah. This was about a systemic failure to protect multiple vulnerable children who were living in dangerous conditions. When Julia Tomlin's preliminary hearing was held in Hampton Court, 14 witnesses testified over the course of the proceeding. Medical examiners presented their findings in detail, explaining the injuries, the timeline of those injuries, and what they indicated about Noah's treatment in the time leading up to his death. FBI agents described their investigation, the interviews they conducted, the evidence they gathered, and the behavioral analysis that helped them understand what had really happened. The 2 male visitors, Brad Bailey and Brian Null, recounted what they saw on June 22nd, providing the critical timeline that proved Julia's story was false. And then one witness took the stand who brought the entire courtroom to silence: Julia's own daughter. According to media reports from the hearing, Julia's daughter testified about growing up in her mother's home. She described, through tears that she couldn't hold back, the physical and mental abuse she and her siblings endured over the years. She testified that all 10 of Julia's children were abused in various ways. But Noah, she said, got the worst of it. Noah bore the brunt of their mother's violence. Noah suffered more than any of them. Her testimony was devastating. Here was a young woman, barely an adult herself, having to stand in court and describe the horrors of her childhood, having to explain what her mother did to her and her siblings, having to admit that her baby brother suffered the most and she couldn't stop it. The judge, after hearing all the evidence over the course of the preliminary hearing, ruled that there was probable cause to certify all charges to a grand jury. The evidence, he determined, showed that Noah's death was violent and unnatural. The medical evidence, the witness testimony, the forensic findings, Julia's own contradictory statements, all of it together painted a clear picture. This was not an accident. This was not a tragic drowning. This was a child who had been systematically abused and whose death was then covered up to avoid accountability. Julia Tomlin ultimately pleaded guilty. She didn't go to trial. She didn't make prosecutors prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt to a jury. She pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, acknowledging legal responsibility for Noah's death. She pleaded guilty to child abuse and neglect, acknowledging she harmed him. She pleaded guilty to concealment of a body, acknowledging she hid his remains and lied about his disappearance. When the judge sentenced her, he imposed 55 years in prison with no time suspended. Every year would be served, 40 years for second-degree murder, 10 years for felony child neglect, 5 years for concealing a body. The sentences would run consecutively, meaning one after another, not concurrently. Julia Tomlin, who was 34 years old at the time of sentencing, will likely spend the rest of her life in prison. According to those present in the courtroom during sentencing, Julia showed little emotion. She stood before the judge. She heard the sentence. She was asked if she understood. She acknowledged that she did. And then she walked out in handcuffs, emotionless, as her daughter and other family members wept. Commonwealth's attorney, Anton Bell, spoke to the media after the sentencing. His words were powerful and reflected the anger and grief that everyone involved in this case felt. He said there was no question in his mind, based on all the evidence he had reviewed, that this child had been tortured, not just abused, not just neglected, tortured. He said Julia wasn't remorseful about what she did to Noah. She was remorseful that she got caught. She was upset about the consequences she was facing, not about the harm she had inflicted on her son. And then Bell said something else, something that captures the gravity of this case. He said that death, for Noah, was a welcome friend, because according to all the evidence, all the medical testimony, all the documentation of his injuries, this child's suffering had been ongoing. Death ended what should never have happened, and that, Bell said, is perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of this entire tragedy, that a young child's death could be viewed as merciful because it ended his suffering. The Noah Tomlin case raises painful and necessary questions about child welfare systems in America. How does a mother convicted of child abuse in 2010 maintain custody of 10 children over the following 14 years? How does the system fail to intervene when a family is clearly in crisis? How many warning signs were missed? How many opportunities to protect these children were lost? According to Noah's family members on his father's side, they barely knew him. Family conflict and geographical distance had kept them apart. They met Noah once, just days before Julia reported him missing. They were trying to build a relationship. They wanted to be part of his life, but they didn't know what was happening behind closed doors. Noah's grandfather, speaking to media after Julia's sentencing, said it simply and powerfully. The system failed Noah. And he's absolutely right. Because somewhere along the way, between Julia's 2010 conviction for child neglect and Noah's death in 2024, multiple systems designed to protect children failed to stop what was happening in that mobile home on Atlantic Avenue. Child Protective Services had been involved with the family before. There were reports. There were investigations. But somehow, Noah remained in Julia's care. Somehow, 10 children remained under her supervision. And Noah paid the ultimate price for those failures. Noah's family, having gained custody of 3 of Julia's surviving children, say they're committed to making sure those kids get the love, stability, and safety they deserve. They say they wish they had known Noah better. They wish they had more time with him. They took him to meet family just days before he died, and they treasure that one visit, that one afternoon where Noah got to play with cousins, got to be around people who would have protected him if they had known what he was going home to. But they take some comfort in knowing he's at peace now, and they hope that by speaking out, by sharing Noah's story, maybe the system will change. Maybe other children will be protected. Maybe lessons will be learned that prevent this from happening to another child. The Hampton Police Division, the FBI, and countless volunteers did everything they could to find Noah. They worked around the clock. They dug through garbage until their hands were raw. They searched in brutal heat. They didn't give up. Chief Salt, speaking at the press conference where he announced Noah's remains had been found, said it best. He said their priority all along had been to find Noah and bring him home, and it was with very mixed emotions that he reported they had accomplished that goal. Mixed emotions because they found him. They brought him home, but not the way anyone had hoped. Not alive, not safe, but deceased, having suffered tremendously, having been failed by the very people who should have protected him most. The 10-hour delay that Julia Tomlin created on June 24th was meant to give her time. Time to construct a believable story. Time to make sure evidence was properly cleaned. Time to rehearse answers to questions she knew were coming. Time to prepare for the investigation she knew would follow. But what she didn't count on was the dedication of investigators who wouldn't stop digging, who would literally dig through 2 million pounds of garbage to find the truth, who would interview every witness, who would analyze every inconsistency. Who would bring in the FBI's behavioral science unit to help understand her deception? Who would piece together what really happened on June 22nd and in the days that followed? That 10-hour delay didn't protect Julia Tomlin. It exposed her, because in trying to create distance between Noah's death and her report to police, she created a timeline that made no sense to experienced investigators. She created gaps that needed to be explained. She created inconsistencies that demanded answers, and investigators noticed. They asked the right questions. They followed the evidence wherever it led. They didn't accept easy answers. They dug deeper, and they brought Julia Tomlin to justice for what she did to Noah. If this case makes you think about child welfare, about the systems meant to protect vulnerable children, about the importance of speaking up when something seems wrong, about the dedication it takes to seek justice for victims who can't speak for themselves, then subscribe to Forbidden Visions and turn on notifications, because we examine cases where the truth takes time to emerge, where investigations reveal what was hidden, where timelines expose lies, where justice, even when delayed, eventually arrives. The Noah Tomlin case is a reminder that behind every missing child report, there's a story, and sometimes that story is far darker than anyone could imagine. This case remains a testament to the investigators who never gave up, who worked tirelessly, who brought Noah home and brought his mother to justice. And most importantly, this case is a reminder of Noah himself, a child who deserved love, protection, and safety, a child who deserved to grow up, to play, to learn, to experience all the joys of childhood. A child who was failed by systems and people who should have kept him safe. Rest in peace, Noah Tomlin. You deserve so much better than what you received.